does the millennial generation think about church these days? And should anyone care what they think these days? So much has been said and written about this generation. I asked my friend Josh Hughes that exact question, and I think you will be intrigued and encouraged and maybe a little challenged by his answer. This is Real with Reed, a safe, honest, constructive place to have conversations about faith from different viewpoints. And episode 4 starts right now. Well, welcome, Josh, everyone. This is Josh Hughes and a friend of mine, and we've known each other for a little while now, and I'm excited to have him on the podcast today. Josh, we're from different generations. That's our difference that we're probably going to highlight today, which if it's not abundantly obvious by looking or listening to us, tell everybody a little bit about you so they get a sense of where you're coming from.
I did my most millennial hairstyle today.
Very nice.
Went for the swoosh,
As did I, but it didn't work. So,
well, I live right on the border between millennials and whatever's next after millennials. I'm 24. I was born in 95. So it's the very last year of being a millennial. So basically what that means is the millennials don't want me, and neither do the people who are actually cool and young. So I walk a fine line in my life between the two of them. But I guess in terms of my story, I've always been floating around, the church world. I figured out very early on that I wanted to do ministry, especially as it related to like live production. So I really wanted to be a technical director for a church, and I pursued that pretty hard the whole way through college and everything else. I actually did get that job. I dropped out of college. I always joke that I dropped out of college to join a band because I dropped out of college my third year because I got the job. So I moved out to Nebraska. And I got married and she got a job out here. So I'm back out east now. And I'm getting notifications from my computer here. That's unprofessional. We'll be all right. Anyway,
so the tech guy. Yeah,
that's right. So I moved back out here, and rather than landing another job with a church, I decided to start a company that resources churches. So that's what I do now. Is I run a company that provides video, communications, basically technical support for churches and nonprofits.
And you have a very unique perspective then on the church world, the different ways that church is done. I know you work with some parachurch organizations, but give us just a snapshot of your faith story. When did faith become real in your life, and how is it a part of it?
Definitely. So I was raised in a Christian home, but it didn't really mean anything to me at the time. It was like that thing I did on Sundays, And we moved away from our church when I was fairly young, like end of elementary school. We moved to a different state, and we just didn't find a church at that time. So we kind of stopped going to church. And it wasn't like we stopped being Christians, like we still read Bible stories in the evenings and whatever else, but it just wasn't a major part of our lives.
Yeah.
And I went to a summer camp thing for paintball of all things, the summer going into high school. And while I was there, they had a guest speaker thing come. I didn't even know it was a Christian camp, but they had a speaker come in who was teaching people every evening. And his name was Lance, and he was a youth pastor at a church nearby, whatever. And that was sort of the week that it made sense to me. And he presented the gospel in a way that I was like, oh, this is about a relationship, not necessarily about doing all the right things or whatever. Yeah. And so it kind of clarified in my mind what that was. And he invited me back to his church, which was called Life Point. I went to that church, and Life Point had been the church that I was going to when I was really little. They just had changed names and moved to a new location. So I went there, and I had a bunch of friends overnight because all the people who I had known when I was in fourth grade or whatever, they were still going to this church, and they were in this.
That's awesome.
So that was pretty cool. So that's when it really started to matter to me.
So paintball was really the key, is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, which it is for many, actually. Yeah. So most churches are led by people of a different generation, older generation. And so my first question to you is, how does that affect you and people in a younger generation? How do you think that the leadership of a church affects the next generation as they look at what their involvement might be?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because I think in America, it might be different than other places. Like I'm half English, so I grew up a little bit in Britain, and in England, there is this idea that people who are older probably have some wisdom and some experience to share, and that you should value that and give them some respect. And in America, there's this idea that people who are older have sort of stopped being relevant and no longer, take care of following trends, and so they no longer have wisdom to share, and so we should sort of ignore them. So it's interesting to kind of see that line. And I have friends on both sides of that divide, at least here in America. I have friends on both sides of that line. And so it's interesting that you ask that. Like for me, I don't know that I have a big issue with being led by someone who's older than I am. I think that the only real rule to leading someone somewhere is that you have to be at least one step further than they are down that path, right? And then you can lead them. So if it's not really a big deal to me how old they are, but I do think that it can be a tripping point when people who are communicating don't take the time to understand maybe the way that this group of people communicates, right? Like if someone's trying to speak to me, but they don't know how to make it relevant to me, like you're using, idioms and examples, hyperboles that were popularized by an older generation. Those may mean nothing to me. Like I don't know, I've never heard a vinyl record. And it's not, and there's a whole world of people who still say that vinyl is better than radio or whatever else. And that doesn't mean that they're wrong, but it doesn't mean anything to me. So if you're going to use that as an illustration or as a metaphor, like I'm not going to follow it. And so I think that that's kind of the tension, is making sure that you are still understanding how each group of people communicates.
Well, that is a bullseye of one of the elements I see. I lead a staff that is multi-generational. And sometimes I am watching people from two very different generations try to communicate with one another. And it is like they are speaking two completely different languages. And I know that their hearts are exactly aligned, but boy, they can't find the language to, be able to communicate that in ways that are meaningful. Well, what would you say, just as a follow-up to that, what are some of the differences that you see generationally in how people talk about faith and how they approach faith?
I think definitely for the older generations, and this is obviously just what it seems like from the outside, because I've never been in the older generation.
Well, that's why I've got you on, right?
That's right.
Your perspective is unique.
But it sure seems to me like faith used to be something that was normal for people, and now apathy is the default. So a lot of the ways that, I've worked with a bunch of different churches, and so I've seen a lot of different styles of preaching, and I've seen a lot of people who communicate to their tribe in sort of a way that expects participation, where it's like, they don't need to figure out what's relevant to your life because you understand the value that they're offering. And I think that with the younger generations, at least especially with millennials who are in that, like our 20 somethings right now, basically, especially in that group, like you have to earn that attention from us by proving that it's going to matter if we stay for the whole, 30 minutes is a long time for someone who's, the average attention span, I'm a marketing company. The average attention span of an American in 2018 is 8 seconds. So if you don't hook me in that first 8 seconds, right, I'm on my phone, I'm texting, I'm doing something else that does earn my attention. And I'm being courteous by giving you the chance to earn it back. Yeah. And that's totally different than how, the adults in my life, I guess I'm an adult, but, the real grownups in my life.
The real grownups. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yes. And so that makes me have two follow-up questions. Mm-hmm. One is that more and more when you see data, demographic data coming out, by and large, there has been a swing in terms of the way people identify themselves with religious preference, and the fastest growing segment is none. And I'm wondering why is that important, and what do you attribute that to?
It's funny. A lot of those, I've spoken with a lot of the nuns in the world, mm-hmm. and a lot of them will still tell me they believe in Jesus. And I think it kind of goes back, at least that I have watched, it goes back to in the early 2010, 2011 space. There was a really well-meaning, well-intentioned guy who put out what I think is a fairly damaging piece of slam poetry called Jesus Over Religion.
Mm-hmm.
And what he was trying to say is that it's about a relationship and not a set of rules. And what people took it to mean is that I don't have to go to church or learn anything about this, because as long as I've got Jesus, like, I'm good to go. And it warps people's perception of faith, because now we've equated faith with religion, or faith with a set of rules. And I think that has kind of spiraled into, now we have this group or this segment of non-believing or just non-affiliated people who might still believe, like, I'm a Christian, I just don't associate with Christians because, they're all mean or they're all homophobic or whatever whatever stereotype they've decided every Christian hits.
Yeah. And so then the second thing is, are we, it seems like sometimes in the church, our response to that is shame on you. You have a responsibility to come to us, instead of, there's some kind of disconnect here. How can we bridge the gap in terms of communicating in a way that people are able to receive it? And so what's the answer to reaching out to people who are nuns, in terms of the church, and in terms, you're a marketing company. Should we have to market the church? How do we reach out to the nuns?
So I'm going to start on that word marketing, because I think that's a word that gets a lot of incorrect connotations. And if we're going to talk about marketing the church, I want to make sure we're very clear. Yeah. Marketing is the combination of the message you have and the message your audience believes they're being told. So if I'm a cynical audience, you might say to me, when you give X amount to our church, we're able to feed X amount of people. And I might still hear a different message than that, which is, I want a new private jet or something. So marketing is not about convincing people to buy stuff. Marketing is about getting everyone on the same page. And that's why I think it's such a big deal for churches right now. I do think that the church needs to be marketing in that sense. But I think that it gets broader than that to, I think the church needs to stop assuming people are coming to them knowing what the value is. Like even if I go to a church because someone has invited me there, I'm only there because someone has invited me there, right? I don't necessarily know what I'm going to get out of it. And if I'm in this religious, non-affiliated group, they generally have some concept of, they're usually in the agnostic section of faith. Like, they have some concept of there is a God. I just don't think any of these people know exactly who he is. Mm-hmm. So the struggle then is, how do we earn their attention? And I think that a lot of the traditional format of a church service doesn't do it. I think a lot of the traditional format of a church service on Sunday is for current insiders, because we sing songs, but we all sing them at once. And it's not like a concert. It's like they're fairly musically simple so that everyone can pick up on them. And so that doesn't make sense to the outsider. Or churches who pass the offering plate, that doesn't make sense to the outsider. And I think that the missing piece is that we've just had a huge communication shift. And in the digital world, you are speaking to at least what your audience perceives as a real person all the time. We're seeing, even big brands like Popeyes. The reason Popeyes is big right now is because they're communicating like a person. And so people think of Popeyes and they go, oh yeah, Popeyes, those guys are cool. Like, they're our friends. They make those silly jokes on social media, whatever. And that's that's why the chicken sandwich took off, because they started making jokes on social media. And that idea that the church could go where, so here, I'll give you some more numbers, because I love data. The average American attends church 8 times a year. That's the insiders. Your insiders give you 8 Sundays. The average American is on social media 116 minutes a day. That's more than, just about 2 hours. So if we started to take our focus off of Sundays as our main outreach, right? I think there's value in coming together and congregating, but you've got to pitch me on it first. And if we started to put some of that value, if we looked at social media not as another campus, or websites not as a campus, but instead as a mission field, and churches were able to reach out to people there and hit their tensions. We saw Jesus do this with the woman at the well, where she came to the well and Jesus acknowledged she was thirsty. That's her physical needs. Then he starts to acknowledge that he knows her. That's her emotional needs, right? I need to be seen and understood, even though I'm a Samaritan woman. And then he starts to minister to her spiritually. And he says, and I'm not accusing you, and your accusers are gone. And that's the order that we saw Jesus do it. And we have a really easy on-ramp to doing that right now with social media, where we can go on social media and we can say, hey, it's Father's Day, or, Black Lives Matter, or whatever the circumstance is, hit people where they're feeling tension, show them, hey, the church is someone I relate with. These are real people, not just some archaic set of rules, making Gregorian chants in a clay monastery or whatever. And once you've earned their attention that way, then we can start to lead them down that path to like, hey, we want something great for you, but you've earned the attention to have that conversation, Yeah.
And so I'm listening to you, and you and I have had some of these conversations before, and it winds my clock to unpack some of it with you. But I can just imagine somebody listening to us right now or watching, and they're saying, see, that's what's wrong. We shouldn't have to earn the right. We're selling out, or we're, and even as I say that in a somewhat pejorative way, that will be reacted to, right? and so that follow-up then is, should we have to do that? And because I believe that there is some downside to trying to make the message appealing. That's the way some people would summarize what you just said. So what's the downside? What's the danger in doing that? And should we have to? You sort of already made the case that we should do that. If we have the best message in the world, we should try to deliver it in a way that people can receive it to as many people as possible. But what's the downside of trying to appeal to a different style audience?
I'm gonna take a couple seconds to digest this, come down off my soapbox. I've had a lot of conversation. That last conversation I've had with a lot of churches recently. So I get fired up about helping people communicate with the people they want to reach. I think the struggle is equating what you're right is being perceived as we need to make church more appealing. The truth is that the truth never changes, right? Like truth is absolute, which is, I guess that's its own hot topic right now. But if I say to you, this lens cap is black, you're going to look at it and be like, no, it's red. And I'm still going to know that the truth is that this lens cap is black, right? Like truth is truth. And I think sometimes we stumble over which things are our opinions and which things are facts. But once we get to something that is a fact, that's an absolute thing. And the gospel is an absolute fact. But the way that people communicate is not an absolute fact. And if you look at what Jesus did to communicate to people on a practical level, like what did he do when he woke up that morning? It's not going to work the same today because they spoke differently at that time. They had different tools. People had different understandings. Just like we were talking about the generational divide just in slang, right? Imagine that magnified over 2,000 years through languages and translations and the way they write, and all those things change. But the truth underneath it doesn't change. And I think if we back up and look at the top level of what Jesus is doing, one, we eliminate a lot of the idea that someone's opinion, like Josh is coming in here and stepping on how church works, because my goal is to emulate what Jesus did. And I think most churches, regardless of their, theology or their kind of subcategory or denominations, I think they would all say to emulate Jesus is the end goal, right? So if we go to emulating Jesus, instead of looking at here's exactly what Jesus said word for word, if we look at the theory of what he did, like with the Samaritan woman, or the way he communicated, what we see is that Jesus went places, and we see it in letters later from Paul to the Corinthians and to other people. They go places, and Paul, before he ever started a church, he would learn the ways of that area. And he would, he described himself as becoming all things to all people. He didn't mean he was diluting the message. He meant he was learning how they spoke and how they interacted and what their world was like before he came in and said, you're doing all of it wrong, because nobody's ever been argued into believing anything, right? Yeah. And I think in the same way, if we now are looking at the sort of the spectrum of communication, and we are seeing, hey, a lot of people are communicating really deep, meaningful content through satire and through memes and through self-deprecation. A lot of that is kind of the in humor or the common language of millennials. And so if the church can get in on that, we can start to, again, earn their attention without diluting down the message, right? We can communicate the same meaningful thing in a different way. And it's just a creative challenge, right? God loves creativity. It's just problem solving. God gave everybody a different set of gifts. And when you put all those people in the same room, if they can solve the problem, how to say the same truth in a different communication landscape, you end up with the church moving.
Yeah. So you brought up two things that I'm going to circle back to. One is, hasn't this been the challenge of the church since the church began? But is it different now, in your opinion, because of the speed of change in the culture, call it culture, or generational change, or the Latin Mass was struggled over, for hundreds of years, because it seems like one possible idea is because the rate of change was much, much slower. They were still doing the same thing. I think the church has always had to do the same thing. Is it just amplified now because of the pace of change?
So I don't know that I have all the answers on this, but I think I'll give you my opinion, right? We just talked about the difference between facts and
Yeah.
opinions.
Give me an opinion.
My gut reaction is that it is the same challenge the church has always faced. I don't think that it's something new that's just come up. And I think there's a lot we could probably learn from looking at how those, different, again, just generationally, like what were churches in the 1800s doing? And how was that different from churches in the 300s, when Jesus had just left? But I think that it maybe is a slightly different problem for us than it was for them because of the level of connection globally, where we have the idea now that is a relatively new idea that we need to communicate with everybody, that if our church doesn't reach them, nobody's going to reach them. But everybody no longer means the block that our church is closest to, which kind of made sense from that idea. But now we're like, well, what if we're not reaching the people in, Uganda or wherever? And it's like, well, there are churches in Uganda who care about people in Uganda. And when we try and spread our message to reach all those groups of people, it ends up hitting nobody. One of the marketing words that I'll throw out there is what we call a target audience. And this is a word that scares churches because they want to say that our church is for everybody. But your church isn't really for everybody because you don't speak like everybody speaks. And you don't, you want to hit a certain group of people that God is sending your way. And everybody else, we can trust that other churches will do that. But because we're so connected, we can see so much more brokenness. Like I can see the brokenness of the guy next door. I can see the brokenness of the country over there to the south. I can see the brokenness of whatever's across the ocean. And so then, like, because we are made in the image of God, we feel broken for those people and we start to try and figure out how we can change it. And it's difficult in that respect. Like my struggle is figuring out, how do I trust God to take care of everything when he's shown me everything? But I don't know.
Boy. No, that's what you said is, it's so significantly important to growth and change, is that it might seem very selfless to say we're for everyone, but in fact, if you dig a little bit underneath that, it's actually quite self-absorbed in saying, what I mean by that is I have to do it. And it might even be, replacing God in the equation to go, I don't know that he's got this figured out. I better jump in and play my part here. I'm going to change gears here because I read something the other day. We have been talking for the past few minutes about the message and about communication and about delivering that message. But I read the other day that if all of what you produce is downloadable, you've missed a critical element of the community of faith, and that is experience. That it is absolutely 100% necessary to communicate in every way possible, in the best way receivable, all of that. We've just talked about that. But if that's all you do, this author was suggesting, you've fallen woefully short of the vision of what the church could, should, can be, in experience that people are able to join in together and have an experience together of God. So how does generational differences affect the type of experience that a church can provide. Maybe you can reply to that, but also this idea that if everything you do is downloadable, you've missed a part of it. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with the statement, because I think the church is more than what it produces, right? Like we're talking about communicating a message, but church was always the people. So
Mhm.
you can't download people and you can't download community. That one's the easy one. The other part of your question, if I were to restate it back to you and make sure I'm understanding
Yeah.
right, is how does the experience of church need to change for different generations? Is that right?
What's the challenge in if we accept the premise that we need to create not just content, but we need to offer experiences in order to be the church? How do generational differences make that challenging? Is can one experience encapsulate people from four different generations?
Got it. I think the generational challenge is a little bit the same in experience as it is in just message targeting, which is just that different generations have a different kind of experience that they're interested in. Most of the people I know wear earplugs when they go to concerts. That's a really simple level difference. But most of the older generation that I know, when they go to concerts, they're like rock on, and now we're a little bit more conscientious about. My generation cares more about our hearing and the longevity and whatever. And so then you could argue they're not getting the same experience out of that concert because they've watered it down or whatever. And so it's like, how do we meet this new, like, hyper aware generation's desire for experience, where there's a lot more flex in the sort of hardcore, like, let's just go do the thing and have the experience and see what happens, and we're a lot more cautious and tentative, and what if we offend somebody, and what if we say our words wrong, and there's a lot more weaving to do. The good news is, I think most of the people my age love experience. I think that it's
Mhm.
a much higher value in my generation than even in the older generations, or maybe even the younger generation. I think the unique thing about millennials is how driven they are by impact, which can sometimes be this vague word that they throw out there to justify anything. But the idea that, like, we are unsatisfied to just watch something happen. We want to be a part of what's happening. And that should be the golden opportunity for the church to involve millennials, because the church is something that is happening. The church is not something you
Mhm.
watch.
Mhm.
Um, I think the experience I think it could reach every generation. I think it just comes down to, like, the vision casting. Like, that's a church word. It comes down to getting buy-in
Mhm.
for what the experience will be. And that, like, I'm going all over the place here, but, like, when we talk about church services and how, you have to earn my attention at the church service or whatever, that doesn't mean they're not valuable or that the shared experience isn't valuable, but you've got to sell me on the idea of a church service when you hit me on social media. Because
Mhm.
then when I get to the church service, I'm bought in, I'm there, my phone's on silent or whatever. And I think in the same way, the church should be an experience that extends beyond Sunday. So maybe the struggle is not so much how do we unify people, but how do we communicate vision to all those people separately, so that when we come together, we don't have to sell anybody on the idea of what we're doing. We can
Mhm.
just be doing what we're doing. Millennials are a very cynical generation. And that means that they assign motive to everything.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of tension with some of the pastors I speak to, because they're like, well, I can't say that because millennials will assume that I'm just trying to get money, or that I'm just trying to go after all the gays, or whatever the thing is, right?
Mhm.
Because the perception usually is that way, because millennials are in some ways the worst. I'm one of them. I get it. But, like, we're
You're
so
allowed to say
cynical.
that, yeah.
We're so cynical. And if we can get that buy-in, then we don't need to worry about clarifying our motives. If we get that, in the communications world, we call them know, like, and trust factors. People feel like they know you, they like you, and they trust you, they'll follow you. And then the experience can be whatever we can get back to, okay, but God has called us to go do this stuff. What if we were doing this stuff?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. All right. So our hope in this podcast is that it would be shareable, that somebody listening to you and I, whether they were 24 or 54, as you and I are, would go, oh, I know someone who needs to hear that conversation. And so I want to give you a chance here before asking me a question. I want to give you a chance to say, if you had a chance to give advice, to give a parting shot to fellow millennials about the church who may be skeptical, who may be cynical and checking the none box, what would you say?
Oh man. To my fellow, well, I'm you for one. To the cynics, I'm very cynical, and what I have found is that if I can replace my cynicism with curiosity, which is not the same as replacing it with trust, but if I can, instead of saying you did this because, if I can ask you why did you do that, then I have a much better chance of growing in my knowledge of the world. Even with, recent, whatever the most recent political issue is, when you watch that right now, it's Black Lives Matter and sort of the racial injustice that we're seeing in our police system. And just by replacing my understanding of, well, the police did this because that, with, hey, tell me what this is like from your perspective, I have learned so much more. And learning is the shared value of millennials, is growing outside of our bubble and not offending people and getting that understanding. So I would just challenge you to, the next time you feel like filling in the blank for someone, like saying, this is why you did something, just ask them and see if their answer is the same as yours, and just see where that takes you. I think that that's a great first step to getting out of the cynic bubble, right?
Yeah. Well, and here's what I love about that is it has an action step for people like me who are in leadership positions to be able to answer the question, why do you do it that way? Why did you do that? And not be defensive in answering the question, but see it as an opportunity to move towards one another in this really important bridging of what could be a gap, but doesn't have to be a gap. We have been blessed at our church since the beginning, really, with a multi-generational congregation. Our first membership class had somebody who was 19 and somebody who was 93. And so I said that day, if we can keep this up, it will provide richness and a level of blessing that you can't manufacture in any other way. So, gosh, I love those words to millennials and Gen Z. We're going to get to that in the next couple of weeks as well. So, all right, at the end of every podcast, Josh, I want to allow people to ask me anything. So, from your seat, fire away.
Man. Am I asking on behalf of millennials, or am I
You
asking?
can ask anything.
Oh, man.
It's an AMA. Ask me anything.
Whew. I didn't prepare for this. I didn't study for this test. What do you think is the strongest opportunity that millennials bring to a church, or what is missing in a church with only the older generation?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I think what millennials bring to any congregation that they are a part of, and let me define that. Right, this is not I tune in for 30 minutes on 3 Sundays in a quarter. That's not what I mean. I mean where you are relationally invested and a part of a community. I think that you bring, as a 20-something person, such a vibrancy and a life-giving energy to everything that we do. I love the fact that I have 2 kids who are both in their 20s, and they are so much farther along in terms of asking important questions about, does this have a purpose? I want this to matter. You use the word impact, and to call, and this might sound harsh, but almost to shake the system and go, hey, you've been doing that for 30 years. It hasn't made any difference in 25. let's do it differently. I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying I want my life to matter. I think that's the message that millennials can bring to every congregation. And the the downside of not having that mix is when when you get a whole room full of nothing but 20 somethings, there's a whole lot of things that can go wrong at that point, without adding in some of the body of Christ gifts and talents and experiences. You can go off base really quickly at that point. As you said, this idea of throwing out the older generation and saying they don't even know how to work the remote. How can they know how to do anything? I think that's very dangerous as well. So, man, I hope that as hard as it is, look, it's always easier to do what you know and to not change. And but boy, going back to your example of that's certainly not what Jesus came and prescribed for his followers. He didn't come and tweak the system. He came and said, well, we're going to do this completely differently. And I think that millennials can help us embrace that that Jesus type of mentality as we try to be his church in 2020. So that's my answer.
I like it.
Josh, thanks, man. Thanks for hanging out and being real. And I really do hope that someone finds this useful enough to share either with a 54-year-old or a 24-year-old that they're trying to have a conversation with, and that we've helped them in some way. I appreciate it, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Reed.
All right, thanks, man.
Now, if you thought this conversation was valuable, definitely subscribe, because there's more just like this one on the way. Around here, we think it's crucial to provide a safe and judgment-free place for people with different perspectives to come together and to learn from one another. Thanks for keeping it